Hello, this is a quick overview of sculpting within Blender 2.8, what I think about it, what's working well and what's not working so well for me, and I'll give some tips and tricks about the whole process of sculpting characters. So it's worth starting off by saying this is a really bad way to start a sculpt, and I'll give you 2 links in the corner and links in the description for better ways of starting sculpting, and that's using things like metaballs or the skin modifier. At first I started doing this as just a practice test, going from a blob or a ball and then turning it into some sort of character, and then it just built and built and grew into this sort of beast that it is. And I've noticed the skin modifier and the metaballs work very well, so I would certainly recommend using those. You can see I started to try and use the metaballs here, but I was actually on my Mobile Studio Pro, so it was a bit awkward and I would have had to have got the keyboard and mouse out, so I just started pulling it out with the snake hook tool. It really is quite an inefficient way of modelling when you're sculpting, and far better to use the other techniques which I talk about. And you can see the trouble I have when I come to things like the hands and the feet, especially when you're using the grab tool and you're trying to move a huge bit of geometry or twist it or turn it in some way, like the fingers in this situation, and it can be a huge pain trying to get that to work. So it's much better to use things like the skin modifier and metaballs when it comes to the more detailed aspects. Also, I've done this as all one shape, so the posing process for me was to actually rig it using the Rigify add-on, which is available in 2.8, but you do have to add it in the add-ons. And then I just used that rig, placed it over my mesh and positioned him and posed him, which is one way of doing it. Other people like Zacharias Reinhardt, and I think Jan Sculpts likes to do this as well. They tend to have separate pieces for arm, forearm, fingers and hands, and then they pose them separately without giving them a rig. There's advantages to that method because you can sculpt a fair bit of detail and you won't have the pinching that you get sometimes when you rig a character. The disadvantage is you do have to kind of do a sculpt over when you boolean them to your main shape, so you sort of join them together. So wherever there's a join, you'll have to go over that section again. But that's not particularly time consuming, to be honest, and both are good ways of doing it. I quite like the rig, especially the rig with Rigify, because it's very easy and quick to put your character into a pose. The other advantage of doing things in separate objects is that it won't lag so much. You can hide different objects when they're not needed, and therefore save on performance. Now when sculpting a character like this, it's really important to have a reference image. I was lucky enough to be sent an anatomy reference model. I think they're called Ecochet. And I was using that in front of me to see all the ins and outs of the muscles and things, and just generally using that to practice my understanding of anatomy, which was really my objective behind this sculpting. But I would also recommend having lots of different reference images with lots of different poses so you can get a good idea of how the muscle moves in different ways and in different positions. Also, you can actually bring reference images really easily into Blender 2.8. You literally just drag from your folder into the viewport and it will appear in your viewport dependent on your camera's location. So if you're in front view, you can just click and drag a front view image in and it will come in as an empty. Much easier and nice and quick. I really like Eevee, and it's nice to be able to mess around with the lighting and things, which I did on the screen on the right. And it's nice to kind of see the final model at a glance. It's also really nice to be able to set up some nice lighting and directional lighting so I can really see the shadows and how they might look in the end result when I place lights into the scene. I thought the Met Cap was really good as well. It had some really nice shading so you could really see the crevices and the detail in your sculpt. The whole setup for the sculpting mode or workspace I thought was really good. A couple of other great features about 2.8 is having all the brushes down one side, rather than having to go into the brush, choose the brush and then back out again. All those icons on the side are much quicker and much easier. I didn't experience any crashes this time whilst using Blender 2.8, which I'm really pleased about. And it just shows how much work they've been doing and how stable it's become. And it was a real pleasure to use. It has taken me a while to get used to the new interface, but there's certainly a lot on offer. I kind of had two goals with this whole exercise. Well, maybe even three. One was just to practice anatomy generally, but the other was to get used to Blender 2.8 and all its sort of quirky interface features, as I see them at the moment. And that really is the best way, is just to dive in, start using it, and get used to where things are. But also I'm slightly getting ready for Sculpt January, which is coming up pretty shortly. You can find out about that on the Sculpt January website and Facebook page, I think. I haven't really decided whether I'm going to fully engage with it this year or not. It was quite exhausting last year, but it was certainly good fun and a great learning experience. So I'd certainly encourage you out there, if you are thinking of it, to give it a go. If you have the time, that is. It's probably a good idea to set yourself a time limit for how long you're going to spend on each sculpt each day. I think on one day I spent 8 hours in total, which I think is just too long really. So I'm going to try and avoid that where possible. It's a bit more tricky if you have a YouTube channel, because you feel like you have to show something at the end of the day, and if it hasn't gone particularly well, you don't feel like you can show it. So maybe I've got a bit better since then, and I can be a bit less worried about that sort of thing and give myself a proper time limit. When it comes to the feet and toes, I don't find it's necessary to make a detailed mesh, but perhaps it would be a good idea to keep it separate and boolean it later, as mentioned before, so the rest of the mesh doesn't get in the way. You can see here that I'm rigging it, and I've set up my rig with Rigify, and it was nice and easy and quick to pose. And posing your models really does make a difference. It's not best practice. If you want this to be a game model, then posing it is actually kind of futile and pointless, because you need it to be in a T-pose if you want to add animations to it. But if you're just experimenting or maybe doing some 3D printing models, then posing them makes them look much better, and it gives them a real vibrancy and life. Using the Rigify add-on's nice and easy. You just bring in the rig, and it's under the bones section once you add the add-on in. And you don't even need to create one of their auto-generated rigs. You can just use the bones to position your model, once you've skinned it of course. I didn't need to do any weight painting or anything like that, because it's quite a dense mesh. If you set up with automatic weights, they tend to just be pretty good to start off with when you have a dense mesh. Remember, as I always say, you start with the big details, and now you can see that I'm working on the minor details of the muscles. I still have a long way to go with my anatomy understanding, but you just keep practicing as much as you can and as often as you can. Now this model's far from perfect certainly, and I could have done with more idea about where I was going to start with, rather than just making it up as I went along. It's always really good to have a wide variety of different reference images, not just anatomy shots, but in this case sort of weird monster alien references as well, to gather different ideas and have a direction that you're going in. I was just sculpting away with no real purpose, and that's not always a good thing. Sometimes it's a fun thing, but not always a good thing, and it certainly takes much longer like that. Now there were a few frustrating features about Blender 2.8. I did notice that when I tried to add textures, which is something I often do at the end of my sculpts, I like to flood fill with a constant detail, which is quite high, and then go in and with an anchor brush draw on some textures, which I do talk about in other tutorials, and you can see more about that on gabbit.co.uk under the sculpting section. But basically you can't use texture brushes very easily in Dyn Topo mode, so you flood fill your mesh and then turn Dyn Topo off. But it was really slow, laggy, and kept crashing on me when I did that, and also I couldn't see the texture on my texture brush, so I think there's still a bit of a bug and something to be worked out there. That's when I actually skipped across to Blender 2.7 to finish off. When you are adding your details and sculpting on minor details like I'm about to do here, it's a really good idea to have a huge selection of brushes that you can choose from, and don't always think that a rock brush has to be used on rocks. I think I used a rock brush on some of my character in places, although actually I wasn't that pleased with how the textures worked out in many ways. I think he was actually better when he didn't have the textures. I kind of wanted to make him look a bit more alien in some way, and that kind of worked, but it wasn't what I was hoping it would be by the end of it. I also started to rush a little bit towards the end, and that's one of my faults, I think. I tend to get to a point and then feel like it's just taking too long, and I need to be a bit more patient with my models at times, and not panic so much about timings, and just enjoy the journey. So I think texture brushes can be really nice. And often when it gets to a stage where you're adding really minor details around the place, it can really be time consuming, and texture brushes can cut that timing down. But it's important not to rush the use and overuse them, and really think about which areas ought to have textures and where you really have to paint them on and add the detail by hand. I think the detailed areas are the really tough bits, and they separate the really amazing artists from the not so good artists such as myself. And that's something I really have to work hard on to get the detailed areas looking realistic. It is also worth considering the scale of your model in your final scene or whatever it might be. If this is your only model, then going really detailed is going to be beneficial. If this was just a head or something like that, then you need to go into the minute details of that face. But if it's the whole body, you don't have to go so detailed, because you're going to be viewing it from a bit of a distance. And in the end, I did actually only show half my model in the final render, because I felt the top half was more successful, and it just looked better to render it like that. I think these sort of fleshy cutout bits were a bit cheesy, really, but it's good to do these things and make mistakes and learn from the mistakes, as I always say. So although these could be classed as failures, they are learning experiences. I haven't included the lighting setup and things like that. That's definitely something I want to cover in later series. It makes a massive difference when you're lighting your models correctly, and it can actually hide quite a lot of mistakes and things as well if you're really clever with your lighting. But it really does add an element of atmosphere and character to your models when you get the correct lighting. It's amazing how much you really need to learn in order to be a great artist. All about composition, lighting, even understanding how a camera works so you can mimic cameras in real life. And the more knowledge you have of these different things, the better the artist you'll be. At the moment I'm just going around smoothing the mesh out because I've added a constant high detail, and then going in and adding my minor details with detailed brushes. But yes, I am using this in 2.7 because it kept crashing in 2.8. And you can see the variety of brushes I'm using, probably going a bit over the top. It is good to add some sort of rough detail to skin. It gives it a bit of character. I've gone way overboard here, but in some places it does work. So don't be afraid to experiment, and I think that's something that I really wanted to do with this model, was just experiment. So it may have gone a bit wrong with the textures and not quite where I wanted it to be, but the main thing is that I'm experimenting, trying things out, and that's what I'm going to learn from. Like I've said, I did use a huge variety of textures to try and get different areas looking unusual and different and odd. And in some cases when I was overlapping the textures, I think that's where I went a bit overboard. It's interesting whilst doing these commentaries, I'm noticing a lot more about my models, and that's something that's really important to do, is look back at your models, and if you can do a time lapse, then it's really helpful to look back and see the mistakes you made. It's also good to give your models a base. I've noticed that Sketchfab, apparently you can add a base in, or they're working on that aspect, so you can take your character straight in and then give it a floor. It really does ground the model, and it helps to position the model much better than it just floating around the place. I thought I might as well give it a base where he's got a human skeleton, and also that gives him a sort of really big giant feel as well. Placing other objects in so you get an idea of scale is a good idea. What I haven't included in this breakdown is the texturing and the materials and the painting. It wasn't really the focus, although I did enjoy giving it a go and practicing those techniques. I used my usual technique of baking from the high poly to the low poly to get a cavity map and normals, and then just coloured in areas that I thought needed a bit of variation. It's tricky sometimes to know when to put those sort of efforts in and how far to take a character, what it's going to be used for, and I think this was mainly a sculpting exercise, so I did a bit just to sort of brush up and remind myself of those techniques and to finish the model, but I didn't really focus on it too much. So there we have it, the final finished piece. Like I say, I'm pretty pleased with it, but it's not without its fault. Do look out for other sculpting tips and tricks, as well as the courses on gabbit.co.uk, where all the courses are free. Do also get across to the Discord server and discuss your sculpts and maybe enter some of the competitions. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps.